Start the sewing of the pouch. So we're going to sew a number onto the front using back stitch, and we're going to use blanket stitch up the sides to secure the pouch together. So for the number, where we've ironed the felt, it's left a bit of a dint where this has came down. So we need to use this as a marker as to how far up the felt to stitch the number, because if we went any more it would be cut off when that came down. If it's not too prominent, the press line, you can just use a pin and just put that in as a bit of a marker, a bit of a guide as to how far up to sew. So for the thread, you need a good length of it, and it comes in 6 strands, the embroidery thread, but we only need 2 strands of it. So you separate the 6 strands off into 2 strands each, and then when you've done that, thread your needle with the 2 strands. And for sewing the number onto the pouch, I like to kind of just sew it freehand, but for some of the numbers it's a little bit tricky, especially the curved numbers. So in that case I can just draw on roughly with a pencil some guidelines for me to follow. If you've got a fabric pencil, that'll also work. Alternatively, if you don't like sewing so much and you don't want to create that look, you could just cut out bits of white felt and stick them on, or sew them bits on, and it would make a very bold numbering on the front. But I quite like just the dainty embroidery to mark the numbers of each. So I've roughly marked out where my numbers will go. So to start, make the first stitch, and then to secure the thread at the back, I'm going to loop that round. So when I make my first back stitch, so you're going in the direction that you want to sew. So I'm going to sew up here and down here, so I'll start a bit further away from that. I'll come up through the back of the fabric, and then it will go down through the front, through the last hole. But for this first stitch, I want to make sure that thread, the loose thread, is pulled through this hole, just so that I can secure it and stop it from coming loose. You can just tie a knot if you want to, but I find this way a bit easier, a bit quicker, just so that there's a stitch in to pull it tight. So we've come up through the back, and now we'll go down through the last hole. That one's a little bit off, so I'm just gonna pull that out and rethread my needle and put it back through at a better angle. Just thread the needle again. So let's come up through the back of the fabric and now back down through the last stitch there. So then again I come up through the back of the fabric in the direction that I'm going in, and then down through the last stitch. And I'm changing direction here, so come up through the back, down through the last hole. And when you're sewing on straight lines, you can use longer stitches, but if you're making a curved shape like a 2, it's easier to make that curve if you use smaller stitches. So when you're finished sewing your numbers, with the loose thread I just like to make a few stitches at the back, so I just loop under previous stitches a few times just to secure it. Before snipping that. So now I've got the number and we need to secure the pouch up the sides. So again we take our needle with 2 strands of the white embroidery thread. If you don't want to see the sew lines, you could use a red thread to match and a green thread to match for the other felt, but I really like the white contrast on the 2 colours. Lovely snowy Christmassy white. So we're going to do a blanket stitch up here. So now to start this one off, I do knot the thread, and I do this a few times to get a good sized knot that'll not pull through the felt. Then I just trim that off. Now, when I start sewing, I'll usually work from the back so that any kind of messier stitches are towards the back, and we'll go from the bottom corner. So I'll go inside the felt, just a little way along the edge, and to make the first stitch secure, I then go around the front and come back up through, or roughly whereabouts that first stitch was, and pull. And that's just the very first stitch to secure it in place. Now I'll do another one up through the front, through the back, in the same place as that last one, but now I'm going to start looping the thread as you do for blanket stitch. So I'm pulling it tight, and just before it tightens I then loop the needle through that loop and then pull. And then for the next one you just leave a bit of a gap, go a bit further down, and you do exactly the same thing. So through that side and then pull, and just before it pulls tight, looping the needle through there and pulling. So that's the basic blanket stitch there. And again you just keep working your way down and catching that loop just before it disappears and pulling tight. And we'll do this all the way down, catching the loop and pulling tight. And it creates a lovely little stitch up the sides, nice and decorative. It's an obvious stitch, so I've done it deliberately so that you can see it's hand sewn, handmade quality. But like I say, you can make the stitches smaller, and you can use colour matching thread, so red thread if you want to hide these stitches. If your thread starts to become a bit tangled, just dangle the needle and let it spin around until it stops, and continue sewing just to get any tangles out, to reduce any knots that will form. Now when you've sewn all up the side with the blanket stitch, we then just need to tie it off. So what I do when I get to the top, so that's the top on this side, I have to make sure I stop before this bit of fabric ends. So now I'm just going to do a few more of them stitches, so going up through the stitch in the same place as last time. I'm going to go over the top a few times, so I'll just do a few more looped stitches. Again, going back through the same place and catching that loop. And then I just like to tie it a bit more secure at the back by looping under those stitches and pulling tight. Once or twice doing that. And then before I snip that thread off, I just take it back through to the inside of the pouch. So I'll go kind of in under where them threads were and make sure that it comes out on the inside so that you're not going to notice the end of the thread cut off there. So I'll pull the needle through on the inside of the pouch and then snip the end. And then we're going to continue in the same way. So now this side, but I like to do, starting from the back, come up through the back and stitch down here, exactly the same way that we've done this side. Again, you take your knotted thread with 2 strands, and so now for this side, we'll come up through the inside of the fabric, just a little way in to attach the knot, then take the needle back round through the front to make that first stitch, and keep the thread on this side when you're pulling it. And I usually put my finger there just to stop it from tightening at the bottom. So you tighten it at the side there, and again go back through that first stitch, but this time picking up the loop. So now that that first point is secure, you can now continue all the way up this side to get that same blanket stitch to secure the felt. Then again, secure the top by taking the needle back through in the same place and doing another blanket stitch or 2. And then loop the needle under, pull, and take the needle back through to the inside of the pouch so that you can snip the thread off on the inside. Then when you finish the sewing, your finished pouch should have the back stitch numbers and the blanket stitch sides to secure it. And don't forget to do alternating numbers, so green, then red, green, red. Then once you've finished your stitching, It's now time to decorate, add your embellishments.